Thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking about fisheries-dependent data. I'm joined by Mike Palmer, who's the Chief of the Data and Information Services Branch at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. Ben Gagliardi, statistician for the Greater Atlantic Regional Fisheries Office in the Analysis and Statistics Office. Anna Mercer, who is the Chief Cooperative Research Branch at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. And Kevin Work, who is a fisherman out of New Jersey and a fisheries liaison. Thank you guys for joining us. We're going to have a quick presentation focusing most of the time in this panel on Q&A, given that this is such a topic that is somewhat mysterious and there's a lot of questions involved with the data we use to do the various analyses supporting offshore wind and fisheries management. So Lane, could you move us on to the next slide, please? Okay, so as some of you who may or may not be familiar with fisheries-dependent data, it is data submitted by fishing entities, fishing vessels and captains and dealers in relation to a fishing trip that has occurred. So it is very complicated. It involves many different data sources through many different processes that are gone through a series of quality control checks and are used for a number of different purposes. And so we're just going to go through a little bit about some of the fundamental items that we use in the Northeast, and we can open it up for questions afterwards. So this is just a quick depiction of what we use. The primary records you can see highlighted in yellow, including dealer reports, port samples, VTR or logbooks, state and landings, sector landings, observer data, etc. So we'll go through each of these and talk a little bit about some of the strengths and weaknesses or limitations and open it up for Q&A next. So next slide, please. So the components of the fisheries data, if you break it down into fundamental elements, it really includes a number of fundamental fields, such as the entity, the vessel, the dealer name, the operator, the owner, dates and times, when did a trip start, when did it end, when did the fish get offloaded, species, obviously that's pretty straightforward. Total catch includes not only the amount of each species that was caught or what occurred to it, but the disposition, meaning was it kept, was it discarded, was it sold. Location, various data sources have different parameters on area. Gear type, not only the type of gear, the number of gear, the size of the gear, any modifications of the gear, fisheries management plan, and some of the programs that are specific to the operations in subject. Vessel economics, including costs, revenues, value, those things that we try to generate some of the socioeconomic impacts. And management, meaning what regulations are in place, the quotas that might affect changes in operations, et cetera, and socioeconomic factors. These are some of the shoreside elements and things that go into making the cost-benefit analysis. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ben for the next slide.
Fishery-dependent data types. Doug kind of ran through most of these. I guess vessel trip report, this is required, and it's our most ubiquitous source of fishery-dependent data. It's required on most fishing trips, except for some exceptions in HMS and lobster, and that's been the case since the mid-90s. Dealer reports are pretty much our gold standard for where we get our landings information from. Vessel monitoring systems are required on many, but not all, fishery management plans in the region. And these manifest themselves as locations every either 30 minutes or 60 minutes coming from active fishing vessels. AIS system is similar to VMS, except it's outside of the federal system and is more of a Coast Guard requirement. I believe it's vessels larger than 76 feet have to have an AIS system on it, but it acts much in the same way in that it produces a fine scale location. I think at a higher frequency than VMS. Observers and at-sea monitors are required to collect biological information. from the catch throughout the range of the stock that's being monitored. We also have study and research fleets, which provide a wealth of more fine-scale information within particular fisheries. And traditional ecological knowledge is outside of any sort of federal stream of data. It's has equal importance, in my opinion. There's really no substitute for eyes on the water to get good information. And then socioeconomic data is can be a little more ephemeral. It's more a second level of information on fuel costs and market trends and things of that nature that come after fish are landed. Next slide. Yeah, so each of these data streams has strengths and limitations. Vessel trip reports, as I said, have nearly universal coverage, so it's fairly comprehensive. In terms of locations, we only get one location per trip, or sub-trip if there's more components to a single trip. And this is all self-reported information. It can be very accurate, or it can be less accurate, depending. Dealer reports are our main, our only revenue source. As I said, it's our gold standard for landings, so we're assuming that they're the most accurate thing we have. Dealer reports don't typically have operational information like gear effort and area, which we would get from the vessel trip report. VMS systems have very precise information. We know what the intent of the trip was from that. But the limitation there is that doesn't cover all fisheries, and even the fisheries that it does cover, it hasn't been required necessarily for more than a couple of years. And if we want to take that information and interpret fishing activity versus transit, there's some rules that need to be applied to the information we have, and that's subject to misinterpretation potentially. The observer at sea monitors also have precise information at the tow-by-tow level. It's very comprehensive, but the coverage is variable. It's fairly low, between 1% and 10%, depending on the fishery. And there's always a concern about observers on a vessel biasing whatever information you might be looking at. And the study fleet has precise area and catch, but again is low and has variable coverage. Next slide. And I think, was this my slide, Doug, or was it somebody else? Okay, I'll keep going. So yeah, how do we use fishery-dependent data? Well, primary use for this venue is certainly to look at socioeconomic impacts on offshore wind development. With combining all the data streams from the previous slides, we can have a pretty good idea what fishery resources might be affected and related fishing communities. In a broader sense, fishery-dependent data is used for all kinds of things, from quota monitoring, stock assessments, ecosystem-based science, and for fishery action analysis. That's the backbone of basically what our agency does. The offshore wind is a newer application. On top of that, protected species interactions can certainly be informed from this information. And last but not least, we get data requests all the time from the public and also from the higher ups in Congress and so forth. Next slide.
Okay, I'd like to turn it over to Mike just to offer a little bit of insight about his role in this and how he can manage and organize the data from his perspective and offer some insights about how the data are organized and whatever else he wants to inform us on.
Well, I was actually going to not talk about how I use the data and how I interact with the data in my current life, but more of my former life, which was as a stock assessment analyst. And I think when I interact with members of the public and even other scientists, I think within the agency and outside the agency, I think there's a general underappreciation for how important fisheries dependent data are to our scientific enterprise. Fisheries dependent data are the backbone of our stock assessment enterprise. The accuracy of those data are critically important. There are more uses for the data than people realize. The data elements that Doug and Ben went through earlier in this presentation, it's not just the catch amounts on the VTR that important. There's a lot of aspects, the gear parameters, the statistical area, the point locations, all of that stuff, information that we collect from as part of our fisheries data, dependent data collection enterprise, is critically important for our stock assessments, our resource monitoring, and for all of our sort of ancillary scientific analyses, such as how do we use fisheries dependent data for offshore wind development uses. And so I think the primary point, I think where I'm coming with this is that as I was interacting with people in my former life, people would always say, well, I want to provide data that goes into the assessment process. I want to contribute to cooperative research data. And my first and foremost answer to everybody is, if you want to do cooperative research, if you want to contribute to the stock assessment process, accurately fill out your vessel trip reports. That is the most primary way that you can contribute to our scientific understanding of what's going on in the ocean, is fill out that VTR accurately. And so as we move forward with our use and integration of fisheries dependent data, I think it's just critically important to keep in mind how important it is, and not to take it for granted that it's somehow of lesser importance than some of the fisheries independent information that we collect. The fisheries dependent information is critically important. Thank you.
Okay, Kevin, do you want to speak a little bit about the dynamic factors here?
Sure. Hi, Kevin Wark from Barnegat Lake, Jersey here, 40-year commercial fisherman. But anyway, I want to a little bit about management. The annual quotas. That it's kind of simple. I mean, the quotas affect the availability of fish and fishing. So this is like an effort control. No fishing, no data. Effort controls. And access. So so if you're limited to access, obviously your effort to fish an area is limited, and it supplies no data. A bit of a challenge for fisheries dependent data collection. You move to closures, and it's kind of the same. If an area is closed to fishing, again, no data supplied. The stream is cut as far as data. Gear restricted, when certain gear types by configuration or type are restricted, you also lose that information. Also a dynamic factor affecting data collection. And exemption areas. This allows for certain gear types that may be selective, so it does provide data, but again, some gears are very selective by nature and will provide broad-based information. So if we move down to biological availability and distribution, availability can be challenging and impactful. And having said that, you can identify patterns and shifts, through this data collection. This is very, very relevant in a changing climate. So, FDD can provide good data, in this area. So then if we move to, temperature changes and weather, temperature is one of the most important factors in fishing, and bottom temperature data has been very limited over the years during fishing operations. So I am a member of Study Fleet, which is a great program, and Study Fleet is starting to use temperature loggers on bottom tending gear, which will be very helpful, especially with all the regime shifts we're seeing in the world's oceans. Weather changes, this is another game changer, when it comes to fishing and data collection. Example, large storms, hurricanes, generating large swell can, drive near shore, schooling fish away from structure, make them unavailable, break up schools, making, availability difficult and affecting, the data stream through restricting effort. So then if we move down to economics, first we'll tackle domestic factors. There can be effects to data stream through loss of market, finfish infrastructure. Here in the Mid-Atlantic, we see, loss of causes and, inner city markets, a lot of people today don't handle whole fish. These generations past, it was kind of normal. Now people don't really do that. And if that affects price, that directly affects effort and fishing dependent data collection. If boats don't sail, no data is collected. So then we move to foreign market price. Foreign market prices, much like domestic, can be very fluid. Tariffs, processing costs, trucking, shipping are all factors that can affect effort and the data stream. Very critical. Fuel, a sharp rise in fuel costs can greatly affect data. If there's not enough financial gain, there'll be a disincentive for the fishermen and slow down the data collection. Monitoring costs, another, effect. If a vessel can't make a decent profit because outside factors and costs, again, another cumulative effect, disincentivizing a fishing trip. And then when we get, to quota or permit lease, we're still kind of talking about the same thing. It's the same type of factor as fuel and marketing, impacting the bottom line of the vessel, and again, affecting data collection. So having said that, all these factors ultimately affect fisheries dependent data collection and are truly hard to quantify. All these stressors on the day-to-day fishing operations and data collection, and as a full-time fisherman, I see these challenges we face daily, and the challenges for data collection as well. But I sure appreciate, the Science Center and everybody working hard to try to figure this stuff out. So thank you.
Okay, Anna, would you like to tell us a little bit about some of the other issues we got going on?
Absolutely. Just to echo a little bit of what Kevin stated, fishery dependent data is information that we get from fishermen, from working with fishermen while they're out on the water fishing. In order for us to use that data appropriately, we have to work with the collectors of that data to make sure we understand what it's telling us and what our analyses are indicating. So just to back that up of what Kevin was saying, making sure we go for full circle when we do work with fishery dependent data. One kind of additional challenge that we have with fishery dependent data is that it's confidential. So this is private fishing business information that fishermen and others are collecting as a part of their daily work life. So confidential fishery statistics are protected by law. So in order to access a lot of the fishery dependent that we have, particularly that's housed within the federal government, there are several different processes that have to be followed. I won't dig into them, but things like MOUs, non-disclosure agreements, having a NOAA funded research project, or individual agreements with the vessel owners themselves in terms of an agreement to access their confidential business information. So for anyone who hasn't worked with fishery dependent data and now is like, oh, I should, I hope there's a lot of you, just something to consider when we're starting to think about how fishery dependent data is applied. If there aren't one of these options for confidential data access, we have to abide by the rule of 3 in terms of sharing data as well as displaying fishery dependent data. So either 3 vessels, 3 dealers, 3 harvesters, and at least 10-minute squares. And that's to protect the confidentiality and the business practices of the individuals that are collecting the information. There is an effort going on in the Northeast region led by Rhoda and John Manderson called the Fisheries Data Trust that's starting to gather various sources of fishery dependent data, basically all of them that we talked about earlier, putting them into a trust that's owned by partners in the fishing industry and giving them the power to share that information with who they want to and use it as they see fit. So that's a project that's been spinning up over the last year or so. And if John Manderson or others are on, I'm sure they can answer more questions about that going forward. But it's another tack to sharing and using fishery dependent data to its fullest potential. Next slide, please. All right, so the last thing we want to leave off with are just some examples of how fishery dependent data is being used to understand and predict the impacts of offshore wind. So what you're looking at here is just a list of projects, the organization and principal investigators that are associated with those projects. And I don't want to walk through every single one of these because it will take way too much time. But if you go to the next slide, the point that I want to make next slide, please, thank you, is that all of these projects are using different sources of fishery-dependent data. So the goal of all of these projects is to develop an approach that allows us to use fishery-dependent data to understand what the impacts of wind might be on fishing operations, on markets, on the economy, and the bottom line of fishing businesses. And so ultimately the results from a lot of these research are going to depend on the scale of the fishery dependent data that's used. And just to give you a visual representation of what we're talking about for all of these different fishery dependent data sources, which can be very confusing. Thank you to Andy Jones who put this figure together. First, what you're looking at, and with the yellow dot there, are what we call our coarse or scale fishery dependent data. So we have full coverage. That's our VTR, our vessel trip report, but you get 1 point, 1 fishing point. Of where they fish for a trip or a sub-trip. If you start to look at some of the finer scale data, for example, the red dots which are showing your observer or at-sea monitor data, as well as your VMS data, which is collected hourly, you start to get a clearer picture of where fishing is occurring and what's being caught. And then ultimately, the real fine scale data sources such as study and research fleets, electronic monitoring, as well as plotter data from individual fishing vessels, you can see that in the red dashed lines, give you the exact tows where fishermen are fishing. And for those of us who've been out on the water, I have, and many of us have, you don't always fish in a straight line. And so thinking about how we use these different sources of data and make sure we're interpreting our results appropriately is really important when we start to apply fishery dependent data to offshore wind. I'm almost done, Pat, don't worry. One more slide. Next
Thank
slide.
you, you're doing great.
All right, so just as the last slide, to give a more specific example about a project that's just being kicked off, that's looking at this question of what is the scale, how does the scale of our reporting of our fishery dependent data estimate impact our estimates of fishing footprint. The Northeast Fisheries Science Center is working with University of Massachusetts Dartmouth School for Marine Science and Technology, SMAST, on this project that exactly is looking to apply various sources of fishery dependent data to answer this question. So are there estimates of operational impacts? Are they different if we use higher resolution data, such as cooperative research data from study fleets and other sources versus observer data versus VTR data versus VMS or AIS data? So Jana Haugen is a postdoc who just came in to start working on this project with SMAST. And she'll start to dig into these questions over the coming year to elucidate how should we use each of these sources of fisheries dependent data to their greatest potential, while also recognizing some of the limitations that we have surrounding them. But I will echo what Mike Palmer said. Fishery dependent data is an incredibly important source of information in terms of how we do science. And we should continue to give a lot of thought about how we apply it as we try to understand the impacts of offshore wind. And that's all I got.
Great. Thank you. One, we appreciate the really rich presentation, the speed at which you did it. So thank you. I appreciate that so much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my, we want to just try this a little bit different. I'm going to try and share my screen with the Minty so you can see that. And give me a minute to move my things around on my screen. And then I'm going to go through some of these questions for the folks. Okay, so the first question actually has got the most kind of hands for like addressing. So the question is some of these I might reword, so bear with my verbal part, but is the resolution of fishery dependent data good enough to understand the socioeconomic impacts of offshore wind? And that might be asked at scale, broadly across a region, specifically to a one offshore wind project or site.
So I'll take a stab at that. There are some, as Anna pointed out, that are highly precise in terms of area resolution, but there are others that have broader coverage. And so there is no one singular fishery-dependent data collection that exists now that gets all of the answers to all of the elements that go into evaluating fishery operations and the potential socioeconomic impacts within the turbine areas. So as Anna pointed out, AIS and study fleet may have higher area resolution, but it's difficult to link those with some of the economic issues such as value and gear type and other operational parameters. So there is no one data source that does everything. They each have strengths and limitations.
Anything else to add from the other panelists before I go to another question?
The only thing I will add is that there are ongoing efforts to use all these sources of fishery dependent data to understand the socioeconomic impact. So I think the answer to this is yes. So we have fishery dependent data at multiple scales that are going to tell us different things about the socioeconomic impact. In order to truly understand that impact, we have to combine and use those data sources together. And that's easier said than done, but there is research ongoing that's trying to do that. So that's the only other thing that I'll add, but otherwise Doug articulated and answered that well.
And Kevin, did you have a comment?
No, I don't, but I agree that, we have to use all sources, especially, we have some limitations, across the board, but, especially in some of the is, so we just have to make sure that, as fishermen, we work with the Science Center to collect and to present the best data we can.
Right. Next question is really around what important caveats would you put on this data? And we realize there's lots of data sets, so that's maybe a complicated question. Meaning what are the limitations to this data that people should understand? What are its strengths and maybe what are some of its constraints, limitations, or problems?
We do have a preliminary list of limitations or caveats, so to speak, on our website or the New England Mid-Atlantic Council's WIN webpage, where we try to articulate at least some upper level limitations or caveats which each data set is. As we went through some of the presentation earlier, logbooks have area precision. There's only one geographic area per trip or per sub-trip. AIS and VMS have higher area resolution, but they have to be linked with other sources. And so what Anna described is we're trying to combine multiple sources to get a more complete picture that utilizes the best assets of each source and tries to compensate for some of the limitations. So we do have a workshop planned, or hopefully in the making, next summer to compare some of the research efforts that Anna highlighted in that last slide to evaluate perhaps what are those best combinations of data streams that get us what we need to get a more comprehensive picture.
Right. Terrific. Again, and probably just a really rich question. It probably has a lot of detail to it. There's some questions I'm going to combine that are going to be up above in a second. The ex-vessel revenues are easy enough to calculate, or easy enough, I guess, in comparison. How have economic multipliers been used to determine downstream impacts of a pound of fish? So it's really the multiplier question. What multipliers do you use? What evidence do you base them on, or studies? How do you think about kind of the downstream effects of economic impact?
That has been a challenge for us overall. Most of the data that we as the agency collects stops really at the first transaction across the dock. And so getting those multipliers requires additional research that members of the social science branch and others at the Science Center are conducting to do some cost estimates, do some revenue impacts, but that gets into the socioeconomic of the ports and the communities, which we do ongoing research for. There is a community, and I forget, maybe Angela Silva can identify the link, but there is some community impacts that go into some of those. It doesn't necessarily get a discrete multiplier, but it does identify the importance of fishing activities to individual ports. That's a really handy tool to see what are the big issues on the port side. But that is an issue we struggle with. There is no one agreed universal multiplier, and I'll let other panelists provide some input on that.
Anything else further on multipliers people want to add from the panel?
Yeah, I'll just add that Tom Sproul at URI worked with the Commercial Fisheries Center of Rhode Island and the Commercial Fisheries Research Foundation several years ago now on a project that looked at doing this particularly for the state of Rhode Island and for the fishing industry in Rhode Island. And that project specifically relied on collecting very detailed business data from fishing businesses, as many as possible within the state of Rhode Island. So in order to do this accurately, to estimate, to develop a multiplier and determine downstream impacts from a pound of fish or whatever it might be, you need very, very detailed data about the supply chain. So it's not to be underestimated the work that it takes to get there, but there has been research at, maybe not necessarily at a regional or national scale, but at a state scale to at least looking at other approaches to estimate these kind of downstream impacts.
Great. And there is a comment from Tom Nees in the chat. I'll just note as another thought about this. This question is actually linked to another one, which is the study fleet has low and variable coverage, question mark. How many vessels are currently in that program? What types of data do they collect and what's their transmission method? And also speak to whether it's just commercial or it's also commercial and rec fishing as well as.
Sure, I can answer that question. So the study fleet currently has approximately 50 commercial fishing vessels participating in the program across the region. So those are commercial fishing vessels only. We don't have any recreational fishing vessels participating in the program right now. Low and variable coverage refers to the coverage of the study fleet in different fisheries. So for example, the coverage of the study fleet within the Illick squid fishery is very high. It's about 80% of participants in that fishery. Coverage of the study fleet in other fisheries is not as high. So that's that to kind of elucidate the low and variable coverage question. It depends on the fishery how good the coverage is from the study fleet. The study fleet participants, and Kevin, I love for Kevin to speak to this as well. They collect very detailed records of their catch and bycatch on every haul, every gear haul. And they also collect coupled temperature and depth information on every gear haul. In addition to that, they have a GPS polling that records their tow path, and then we, within the Science Center and Cooperative Research, have a program that allows us to combine all those data sources. So we have a combined, what path did you fish, what were the environmental parameters, and what did you catch? So that's kind of the information that we get from Study Fleet. Kevin, do you want to speak to that as well? You are directly involved.
Yeah, just repeat the question for me. What were we?
I think, Kevin, the question was, let me just go back to it. Sorry about that. Is, how many vessels are currently in the program? What types of data do they collect for what fisheries? What is their transmission method?
I upload, to the Verse web portal. Study Fleet is much more finite than the VTR system. You can gather a lot more information from it. Each individual haul, it does automatically, if you traverse through a stat area, it picks it up, it knows where you are because, it's recording. It's just a much more fine scale, and it's developed over the years, new versions of flounders, and the current one is working pretty good. And so no, I think it's really relative. You can pick, like to look at a VTR, like I can look at someone in my fisheries VTR as anyone could that's in their particular fishery, and you can derive a lot from that. But to hand it to someone, doing the data collection, it really wouldn't be the same to them. You can just tell, if you've been involved in a fishery, how a man's approaching his day and his soak time or his tow time or whatever may be the case. As a fisherman, you can break that down, but it's difficult. So I think Study Fleet takes some of that variability out. You can see, how quick someone, like if I set my net, how long it sat before I went and grabbed it. You can see it has tracks, vessel tracks. So, it's just a really good system. So I think that I'd like to see more of it. John Hoey has done a great job with all that. And I just can't say enough. I wish that we had it 35, 40 years ago, because it would tell a story. It would tell a story of climate change and regime shift and in the Mid-Atlantic. And I'm sure it's the same in New England in some fisheries. It would tell a story, and unfortunately we don't have that. We just have anecdotal information and landings data, but you just can't break it down like you would be able to with a system like Study Fleet.
Kevin, thank you. A question about how could wide-scale deployment of camera-based monitoring change the use or value of fisheries-dependent data? So again, with a lot more structure in the water, a lot more cameras, theoretically you can learn something. How would that relate then to FDD, do you think?
Is that question for me?
It's for whoever wants to answer it.
I'd be happy to tackle it if anybody wants me to jump on that.
Well, Mike.
Sure. So we're working on a couple of EM pilot programs in the region. They're pre-operational models of EM, which are scheduled for operational implementation in the groundfish fishery for the audit model approach, which is where we're using a random sampling of the EM video footage to validate the self-reported discard information that's reported on a vessel's VTR. And then as long as the VTR reported discards are within certain thresholds, we're using the VTR reported discards. If they fall outside of the thresholds, then we'll replace them with the EM generated discards. And they're active research moving towards improvements in those methods that will sort of developed ways of better leveraging and incentivizing the accuracy of the self-reported discard information and providing lower review rates for fishermen who have shown a capacity to accurately estimate discards. And so that's what's being developed in the groundfish fishery, along with a maximized retention EM use, which is really just using EM to monitor compliance with discard prohibitions of regulated groundfish species. And that's similar to how EM is being implemented in a pilot project or pilot capacity in the IFM herring fishery as well. That's slated for rollout this spring. How could EM improve our understanding of fisheries dependent data? I think one of the real powerful things with EM is that we can have it running 100% of the time, and then we can randomly subsample it at certain frequencies. And so it can be a very effective tool at addressing some of the observer bias, observer effects that we've detected in the groundfish fishery. Knowing that there's an opportunity for every trip to be monitored potentially. One of the challenges that we're seeing with EM right now, at least in the pilot implementations, is that the data collection suite that we're collecting from EM video footage right now is not the full complement of fisheries dependent data that we have available from, say, our observer programs, or even from some of our fine scale self-reported data like study fleet. One of the challenges with our EM programs right now is we're not getting retained catch estimates from our EM video footage review. We're only getting estimates of the discarded fraction of the catch. We can't get detailed information on some of the gear parameters, like identifying mesh size or identifying gear size, and some of those finer scale gear metrics that might be important for developing finely tuned CPU indices may be a bit of a challenge. But it holds a lot of promise, and as we're moving forward, we're trying to improve the types of resolution that we can get from EM footage. We're trying to automate the review of the EM footage to drive the cost down and make it a much more cost affordable monitoring option. I think to sum it up, EM is a very effective and viable monitoring tool that will be part of our fisheries dependent data suite. And it will be a very effective monitoring tool for getting fine scale accurate information on commercial fisheries as we move forward, and also recreational fisheries. I would imagine that there would be development in that sphere as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, another question that's come up a few times about lobster and crab fisheries and kind of what spatial coverage knowledge we have. Do any of them participate in the study fleet? Kind of speak to those more the kind of fixed gear folks.
I can take that one if that's okay with folks. So yes, the lobster and crab fisheries in the Northeast do have a significant footprint on the Northeast continental shelf. There are not standard, the use of VTR and VMS within that fishery is not standard between the states. It is identified by each individual state. There have been efforts by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission to standardize that and to increase the level of reporting for that fishery. I think there's an ongoing concern that the footprint and impact of that fishery might be underestimated because of the lack of spatial information from that fishery. So yes, to confirm, that is certainly a concern and something that that most everyone who's working in this space of impacts offshore wind is aware of. There is a research project that's led by the Commercial Fisheries Research Foundation, the Lobster and Jonah Crab Research Fleet, that collects, again, fine scale information as well as biological data from the lobster and Jonah crab fishery across the region. So that could be a source of information to use to understand some of these spatial impacts on the lobster and Jonah crab fishery. It has some of the same challenges in terms of coverage of the fleet, of participation, similar to the study fleet, where you don't have full coverage of a fishery. So you have to use the information you have and scale it up, if possible, to the entire fleet. So I think there is some additional work that needs to be done in terms of estimating what the impact on those fisheries might be from offshore wind.
Great. I'm going to ask one more juicy question. Just note a few other comments and then we'll move on just because of time. So Are there any fisheries revenue estimates for the wind energy areas that everyone or most everyone agrees on? Or is the uncertainty too great in these models? So where are we in being able to have broad scale agreement, as there's ever such a thing in fisheries, around kind of the revenue assessments for wind energy areas? So that's a good juicy one to wrap the panel up with.
So I think I'll just highlight some of the efforts that the Northeast Fisheries Science Center and the Greater Atlantic Regional Office, particularly Ben Gagliardi on the panel, and Garrett DePiper, Dennis Corvey, and a few others, are working on trying to model using the fisheries footprint approach that Garrett and Sharon Benjamin have developed over time to take VTR data and make a higher probability. So that is one effort that we're using. It builds on an earlier methodology identified by Kirkpatrick in an earlier paper. I wouldn't say that there's universal agreement on it, but that is some of the efforts that we're using to standardize our fishery-dependent data outputs for offshore wind development. It is being incorporated into some of the impact assessments for wind projects. But there are other methodologies, as Anna identified. There are methodologies by University of Rhode Island and others that have utilized other techniques to try to get a sense of who's fishing where and what the potential impacts are. So we're working on that. As Anna mentioned, there's a number of projects out there to trying to see what's the best practice, and hopefully we can convene those experts next year and talk about what is perhaps the benefits of various approaches and look to optimize them.
Great. I just want to note a few other things. I think there's a number of questions around being aware of collecting data kind of affecting kind of cable routes and corridors, not just wind energy areas themselves. So I think that came up. I think there's a question about kind of fairness and data transparency between the industries that came up. We talked about fixed gear. Again, I want to be clear about kind of assumptions and limitations of this data. People mentioned that as well. And there's some citations there as well that came up. I didn't get to all of these. So a lot of good questions. I think there's also note, one thing that I got that I think Maggie received is that study fleet catch rate information and bycatch estimates have been considered in assessments. So it sounds like that, in fact, in some cases, actually the study data, the dependent data has been included in stock assessments in some cases. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. So particularly in the last couple of years, there's been more use of that information in assessments. I'm happy to provide more detailed information at a later time to anyone who's interested.
That's great. Panel, thank you. Super rich, a lot of detail. We only began to touch the surface of this kind of rich sort of data sources, and obviously important, as people have raised for a variety of reasons in terms of moving forward. Again, Mentimeter will capture all of these good questions and statements in the meeting summary. I wish we could get to all of them. Okay, we're going to have one more rich set of presentations on fisheries independent data. Andy Lipsky is going to be the moderator.